We're just sending out the link. So we'll give people a minute before initiating. We're waiting for people to arrive at the moment. It looks like one person has joined the class. So we wait till the rest of the group comes on. Hold on a second. Let me see what's going on here. We're still waiting for the rest of the group to come on. So we have 3 people in now. Just give it a minute or two before kicking off. Okay, we have one person left to come on. We have 4 people now. I think we'll start, inshallah. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. I'm trying to pull up the book, and it looks like the file is not. Okay, I have to re-download the book again. So I'll just use the Arabic. Bismillah alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Amma ba'd. So in the last session, we were talking about the sources of knowledge that indicate to us that the Salah is an obligation. Now, the only 2 primary sources of knowledge, or let's preface that by saying that in Islam, the foundation of knowledge is al-wahi, or revelation. The deen of Islam is revealed to us is not a deen which its primary source is the intellect. Although the intellect has the ability to determine certain things with limitation, when it comes to the issue of legislation, that all of that goes back to revelation, right? The intellect applies itself in understanding revelation and then is guided by the principles which come to us by way of revelation. So the sources of Islam then become known. The primary sources are determined. And those primary sources are the book and the sunnah. So the task in Usul al-Fiqh, first of all, is to determine what is knowledge, what is not knowledge, and how do we understand. And so when it comes to Islam, the source of knowledge is revelation. And so then from there, the primary source is the Quran. And then the sunnah goes along with that. Some of the ulama say that the sunnah is explanatory. Some of the ulama say that the sunnah stands on its own and also has the function of explanation. That type of difference among the scholars is not a real big difference. In any event, the book and the sunnah are the sources of knowledge, the primary sources of knowledge. At the same time that the Quran and the sunnah are sources of knowledge, they also teach us that there's other principles that are operational, right, that we follow, and those sources are considered sources which are supplementary or sources which support our understanding or sources which are secondary, sources which are dependent upon the primary sources. So they call them yani al-hujaj al-tabi'iyya, or those proofs and those evidences, which basically are dependent upon the book and the sunnah, their secondary sources. It's not that easy to translate the concept without having to give a lot of different words so that you have that understanding. So we have the Quran, the Sunnah, and then we have things like consensus or ijma', which is an agreement of the representatives of the ummah in a particular time period, in agreement on a matter of deen that's based in the book and the Sunnah, the evidence that they're falling back on, and their agreement is one in which there's no one that disagrees. So it's a consensus. It's not just a regular agreement. That is not a proof in and of itself. So sometimes we'll say that the proof for that, there's a consensus that we shouldn't do A, B, or C, right? Meaning, at the end of the day, that there's no disagreement. This is a clear-cut issue, right? And there's not a lot of masail or a lot of issues which you find that we come back and say that there's a consensus. Why? Because at the end of the day, once you say that there's a consensus, it shuts down any discussion. And so there's some things which are clear, and then some things which are not clear in matters of practice. And that lack of clarity that may be there is so that research is done. And once that research is done, it allows for flexibility in application. So something not being clear is not a bad thing in and of itself. But we can't practice the deen if a matter is unclear to us. Any sort of practice has to be based on clarity, right? And so at the end of the day, you have the book, you have the sunnah, and you have consensus, and then you have what they call right, or I would say, for the sake of simplicity, the role of the intellect. And some, in a formal sense, they say qiyas or analogy. But qiyas or analogy as a source in the Sharia of knowledge, a lot of different principles come under it. So some, you can easily say that there's four sources of the Sharia. Two are primary and two are secondary, or they basically follow or complement the book and the Sunnah, and they're contained within. So you have Quran, Sunnah, consensus. Consensus always has to go back to a proof that's in the book of the Sunnah. Most of the times, consensus is just clarifying an issue. It's an issue which it basically is putting to rest any sort of debate on it. And then you have the issue of qiyas or analogy. And what qiyas or analogy does is that it extends a ruling that's known to a situation in which the ruling is unknown. And so we may have two situations. One in which we know this is haram, obligatory, right, or recommended, whatever it is. We know the ruling on this issue. And so, but we have a similar situation over here, but we don't have a clear ayat of the Quran or a hadith to speak to that situation. So what we do is we compare that situation to the situation that we have knowledge on. And so if they're similar enough, and this is for more detail, is for another conversation. But for the sake of simplicity, if the two cases are similar enough, then we take the ruling from that matter that we know what it is that the deen says about it, and we apply it to the matter in which we're trying to understand what the deen says about it. And the best example of that is the issue that we know that alcohol is haram in Islam, to drink the alcohol in Islam. The act of drinking alcohol is haram in Islam, better said. Okay, so what do you do with drugs? So drugs, the Quran and the Sunnah don't explicitly speak about them, but they indirectly speak about them in effect with the issue of intoxication and so on and so forth. So because intoxicants are like of one family, right? So then the ruling that we have that pertains to alcohol, we apply it to the issue of drugs, right? And that's how we come to the conclusion that that's how we come to the conclusion that the alcohol is haram. That's how we come to the conclusion that the drugs are haram, because the alcohol is haram, and then the drugs and the alcohol take the same ruling. And so when he says here, Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah, its obligation is evident from the book, the Sunnah, and consensus. He's talking about the obligation of Salah. The fact that it is so widely known makes his discussion unnecessary. And we mentioned that, although he doesn't say that explicitly, but there's something that's called ma'lumun min ad-dini bid-durura, that there's things that are known necessarily regarding the deen. There's some ruling, some knowledge that everyone knows, regardless of who they are, regardless of their standing. Everyone knows who they are. And what happens is that when that type of knowledge is widespread, there's not even a point in having a discussion about it, because it's known to everybody, whether the person is a scholar or not a scholar. Some of the issues which are unclear or need to be made clear, or some of the issues which have some detail, may need some discussion. But matters that are widespread, known to the people, there's not, like, every Muslim knows, even non-Muslims, that, Islam obligates prayers, at the minimum 5 prayers a day. And so that's why that principle comes in. It's so widely known that it's not necessary to even discuss the issue. So here he's talking about the basis for why it is that we know that the Quran and the Sunnah obligate the Salah, right? So the basis for that is that the Quran and the Sunnah are sources of knowledge, right? And then from those sources of knowledge, we learn that there's something that's called consensus and so on and so forth. So when he talks about, what legitimizes the fact that we're saying that the Salah is obligatory, the fact that that the revelation itself determines that. Revelation itself has explicated that. How do we know that revelation has explicated that? What is revelation? Revelation is contained in the book and the Sunnah as sources of knowledge. The Ummah accepts these as sources that transmit and communicate revelation. Okay, so these sources, Quran and Sunnah, which are revelation, they legislate certain things. What do they legislate? In this case here, they legislate Salah. Okay, is the Salah only made obligatory by the Quran and the Sunnah? No, is also a matter in which there's a consensus on it, meaning that there's no disagreement among anyone that's associated with Muslim, whether they're from Ahl al-Bid'ah even, but just from our circle for right now, among the Sunnis, is a matter of consensus. The Ummah itself has determined that what the Salah is an obligation, so no one can negate. And so then he goes on to say that the discussion moves from how do we know that the Quran and Sunnah are an obligation to more details. So in a general sense, we know that the book, the sources of knowledge which tell us that the Quran, the sources of knowledge that tell us that the Salah is an obligation are the Quran, the Sunnah, Ijma'. And it's just a matter that's so widespread that doesn't even need a lot of detailed discussion. So that's how we think about issues. So how do we know that zakat is an obligation? How do we know that fasting is an obligation? Right? That's why we call these the pillars of Islam, because these are things that are so widely known that the deen is founded on them. And so it's the same thing, the same type of discussion will occur. You know, what are the sources of obligation for fasting? What are the sources of obligation for Hajj? What are the sources of obligation for the Salah? So on and so forth. What are the sources of obligation for the zakat? And so once you get beyond that, the sources of knowledge, and we said that there's primary sources of knowledge and secondary sources of knowledge, right? And these are evidences. In Usul Fiqh, they're called evidences. The dalil. Once you get beyond the dalil in the general sense, then you get to the issue of the dalil or the evidence in the specific sense. So now we're not talking about what are the sources of knowledge. Now we begin to talk about what's the particular hadith, what's the basis, within the Quran and the Sunnah that you're using, right? And so even if you say ijma', even if you say consensus, even if you say qiyas or analogy, right? You still have to come back to a particular ayat of the Quran or hadith, as a basis, somehow or some way. And there's also a little more complexity to that, but for simplicity's sake, we'll keep it at that. What we will mention is that there's such a thing as a dalil al-murakkab, that compound evidences, that you bring a number of evidences together to make a case. It's not always the case that you just make an argument for something being obligatory or non-obligatory, something being halal or haram just from one evidence. That's not the case. Some people are stuck on that. And we'll see that as we begin to deal with the material more. So he says that there are two opinions regarding the number of daily obligations. So Imam Ibn Rushd moves from the issue of the obligation, how do we know, now to what is the obligation. Before we can get to what is the obligation, the issue of frequency comes up, because the scholars of Usul Fiqh, they have that debate. They have that debate that takes on, like, is every time that we find that something is an obligation, is it something that's perpetual or something that's limited to a particular time? So fasting is limited one time a year. It's not. It comes up every year if we're alive and if we meet the conditions, but it's one time a year. Hajj, one time in the life, right, is an obligation. So it's not something that's obligatory every year, like the way that fasting is. Zakat, every time, we meet the requirements of zakat, it becomes obligatory, right? So it's not necessarily obligatory every day on us. But Salah is obligatory upon us on a daily basis. On a daily basis once or more than once. right? And so that becomes the issue on a daily basis, once or more than once. And so here he's making the argument that there is a determined number of prayers. Okay, how do we know that there's a determined number of prayers? That's the argument now. There are two opinions about the number of daily obligations. First, and that's the opinion of the majority, is that there's only 5 daily prayers. How do we know that? Will come about. That'll come about or become clear. There's another opinion, and that's that there's 6 daily prayers. How do we know that? That's something which will be made clear, right? And so then, first thing is, what is the issue? The issue here is that we have a salah that's obligatory. What else is the issue? The issue here is that the salah is obligatory a certain amount of times. How many times is the question? Well, we have 2 schools of thought on this. Okay, that's how he begins to frame. So we have the issue. What is the issue? We have salah that's obligatory. Okay, what flows out of that? That is obligatory upon us multiple times a day. Okay, so what is it that's said on this issue? Yeah. What is the exact time? Okay, so here is this an issue which is clear cut? There's no discussion on it. Is it a matter which is not debatable? No. The issue of the salah being an obligation is clear cut. There's no debate on it. But the issue of the salah being obligatory 5 or 6 times or 7 times a day, there's a discussion on that. So, firstly, he breaks it up. He breaks up the discussion into 2 parts: the position of the majority, the position of the minority. So the position of the majority of scholars is that salah is 5 times a day. The position of the minority of scholars, that really breaks up into 2 parts. He mostly is bringing just one school, but that breaks up into the position of Imam Abu Hanifa that says it's 6 on a daily basis, right? And then the position of Imam Ibn Hazm, which he includes in that Tahiyat al-Masjid, which anytime that you come to the masjid throughout the day, that the 2 rak'at of Tahiyat al-Masjid, of remembering Allah, of noting that you're in the presence of Allah. Some people say greeting the masjid, but the reality is that you're in the dhikr of Allah, that's an obligation. So for Imam Abu Hanifa, the issue becomes, is the witr prayer an obligation? We're not going to go into the discussion where he says there's the disagreement about whether the obligation established from the sunnah is wajib or fard, is of no consequences. We're not going to go into that, other than to just note that the Hanafis, they have layers of obligations. So it's not just that something is an obligation, but there's something is an obligation, right, with that's extremely emphasized. And then another thing is an obligation which is not as emphasized as the other. So they have a division between what they call fard and wajib. But for the majority of scholars, fard and wajib mean one thing. And so the only thing with that that's beneficial to know is that that's really attached to the issue of punishment and reward. Punishment and reward. And so they look at obligations as being layered, having degrees, right? It's still an obligation for them, right? But it's just of a different degree, right? It's not something. Basically, I can say it like this: if something is fard and you deny it intentionally, then what the consequence of that is being blameworthy of unbelief. Whereas something is wajib, right, and you basically deny it, is not going to have the same weight. So they just look at the issue in scales. They look at it in scales and with a little more precision and detail, and they make the argument. But for the sake of simplicity here, we're not going to get into that further than that. So here, Imam Ibn Rushd, he outlines the issue. And then he tries to determine, is this a matter which is clear cut or not clear cut? Is this a matter in which there's a discussion on it? Okay, if it's a matter that there's discussion on it, how does that discussion take place? Okay, this is a matter that there's discussion on it. And you have two camps. You have a majority group, a minority group. Is there a difference between them on this issue? Is it a difference that's worthy of a discussion? Okay, he says yes. Now, the reason for their difference is that there's a hadith that seem to conflict with each other. They seem to conflict with each other. So these are hadith, right, that confine the obligation to 5 prayers. They're clear cut and they're known and they're well established. And one of those is the hadith which talks about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam making the journey of Isra. There is determined that the salah is 5 times a day. So then there's a number of other evidences to support that. So that's why the majority stayed with that opinion. Now the issue comes up with the witr prayer. The witr prayer, there's some hadith that convey the meaning that the witr prayer is an obligation, like that of Amr bin Shu'aib, who related from his father and from his grandfather, radiallahu anhum ajma'in, that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Allah has added a prayer for you, and this is the witr, so keep it up. They also include the hadith of Haritha ibn Hudayfa, who said the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came out to us and said, Allah has commanded you to observe a prayer which is better for you than the red camels. This is the witr. He has determined that you observe it in the time between the night prayer, the Isha, and Fajr. In addition, there's the hadith of Buraidah al-Aslami. It says that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the witr stands confirmed, and he who does not observe it is not one of us. So the majority of the ulama, they understood those narrations in light of the narrations that talk about the salah is only 5 times a day. And so what they concluded was that it's just recommended. Witr prayer is recommended, although it's not just a regular recommendation. It's emphasized, but it's not at the level of an obligation, because most of them practice the witr prayer. Right? So Imam Abu Hanifa, he looked at these ahadith that emphasize the witr prayer, and he saw that it's, a lesser obligation, but it's still an obligation based on their system of categorizing the ahadith and the ayah and the language of the Quran. And so the majority, they said, hold on a second. Yes, you don't leave off the witr prayer, but it's not an obligation. So that if you were to if you were not to pray one day, it's not sinful. But somewhat they agree with the Hanafis. How so? They agree with the Hanafis from the angle that you shouldn't leave it off. They just disagree that on calling it an obligation. And so the evidence for that is that, those who leave off the witr prayer, their testimony is problematic in the court system. So those who maintain that the ahadith that pertain to the witr add on another obligation, right? And they're thinking, which is Abu Hanifa and them, they're thinking these are hadith, they abrogate that one hadith. So we know that the deen comes in stages. And so there's a concept of abrogation, meaning that at one time we practice one thing, but then with more commands and information, what comes later right, may cancel out what came, right? Like before, we used to pray towards Bayt al-Maqdis, and then Allah changed the obligation of praying towards Bayt al-Maqdis so that we pray towards Mecca. And so in the beginning of the da'wah, that was okay. In towards the conclusion or the end or the completion of the mission of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that became problematic, right? And so in the beginning of the da'wah, 5 prayers weren't obligatory, right? In the same way that we see once the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam makes the journey of Isra, after that now that becomes obligatory because the Deen is revealed gradually. And so sometimes when the ahadith conflict each other, they appear to conflict with each other. If they can't be reconciled, right? If you can't reconcile them some way to make sense of them, then some of the ulama call on the issue of, there's a process to this, but some of them call on the issue of abrogation. So the two ways of dealing with conflicting traditions, apparently, right? Because the hadith really don't conflict with each other. Unless the hadith is fabricated, then it will conflict with the general system. But here we're not talking about fabricated hadith. We're talking about sound out hadith. So they have to, because they come from the same niche of knowledge, if there's an apparent contradiction, somehow or some way we have to make sense of them, right? And sometimes we find that. We find the hadith that we read in one place. We may read something in Riyadh al-Salihin and we understand something. And then we go to another lecture and then somebody else is reading another hadith, or we read something on the internet, whatever, and it seems to be a contradiction. And so we're trying to make sense of that. And so the scholars have rules how we can make sense of these things when the ahadith appear to contradict each other. So here in this example, we have two sets of hadith. One set, the language is clear that salah is 5 times a day. In another set of ahadith, the ahadith can be read to emphasize, recommend the prayer of witr, and at the same time show that it's an obligation. So because the majority of scholars don't have that system of language, that's a different issue. But you're right, some hadith are specific, but that also, that'll come up in the book of prayer, in the section that pertains to Mu'adh bin Jabal praying with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and then praying with his community. So then that opens up the discussion that they had regarding, the ulama, they open up the discussion based on what Mu'adh did, and they begin to talk about, can you pray a non-obligatory prayer with a person that's praying an obligatory prayer in order to create a jama'ah so that you get the blessings of the jama'ah, right? Or say, for instance, or I'll put it to you like this. You come into the masjid late. The Dhuhr prayer was established. There's a brother making sunnahs. You join with that brother in the salah of Dhuhr, but that brother is praying sunnah and you took him on as an imam and you're praying salat al-Dhuhr, which is an obligation. So now there's a difference in intention. And so that's a whole discussion in and of itself. But some of the scholars will say, well, it's allowable because Mu'adh bin Jabal did it. Other scholars will come and say, well, hold on a second, that was specific to Mu'adh bin Jabal. The other group will say, hold on a second, what's your evidence to show that it was only specific to him? Right? And so those discussions are very real discussions that are in the mix. And so here, the witr prayer, is not an issue that's specific to one person. Is an issue that is a discourse that's directed to the whole of the ummah. What's the discourse? The emphasis on the witr prayer. May Allah allow us to establish it. So the two ways that the scholars dealt with dealing with these two positions or groups of ahadith. What I want you to know from here, I don't want you to get lost in the details. What I just want you to take from this is to see, okay, don't get scared when you see ahadith that seem to conflict with each other, right? When ahadith conflict with each other, there's a way of dealing with that. And that's why some people get in problems when they read the Quran and Sunnah, because they don't have the tools. So here, in reading these discussions, we may not get everything in all of the details. We may not comprehend everything. But this is an exercise in teaching us how to think the way that the scholars thought. And so after reading the books of ahadith, they realize that there's a hadith which command the salah to be obligatory aside from the Quran. And they realize that there's a hadith which emphasize the witr prayer to the point where it looks like it's an obligation. And then the question comes up, well, these are hadith which obligate us to only pray 5 times a day are clear cut. These are hadith that emphasize the witr where it looks like it's an obligation. The language is not so clear. So we need to arrive at a point that we gain in clarity. And so the principles that are used for dealing with the language in this case, according to the majority, the only thing is what that's an obligation for us to pray is the 5 daily prayers. Why? Because the language of those ahadith is clear cut. Over here, in the emphasis of witr, the language over here for them doesn't indicate that it's an obligation, and there's no other evidences to indicate that these ahadith will cancel out those ahadith. But for Imam Abu Hanifa, that's not the case. So for Imam Abu Hanifa, because of the system that he has, it changes the whatchamacallit, it changes the way that the language is looked at, because he looks at the obligation in tiers or degrees. And so those who maintain that in addition over the 5 prayers amounts to an abrogation, those who said that the salah is 6 times a day, including the witr, and for whom these traditions about the witr did not reach a level of authenticity sufficient to abrogate the widely known and established traditions, preferred the later. Right? So those who maintain that in addition, so those who basically, those who said that if, in order for us to cancel out 5 times a day and say that that the salah is 6 times a day, you have to give us an evidence. And so you have to give us something that will abrogate the evidence and replace it with another ruling. You don't have that evidence. And the ahadith that pertain to it are not at that level, that we can say that they have the power to cancel out. Why? Because these ahadith, the language is clear, and these ahadith, the language is open to understand that what the ahadith are saying is that it's highly recommended. Right? And so that's the case that they built. And so further, the limitation of 5 is established by the tradition of Isra. In the words of the Exalted, my decree is not altered, which apparently imply that nothing is to be increased or decreased. Though they convey a stronger probability of decrease. And what is revealed as an informative sentence, not a command, is not subject to abrogation. That in itself, we don't want to get into too much detail right now with that type of thing. We just, because that necessitates of us going into the Arabic language. Those for whom the strength of the traditions which imply an addition over the 5 reach a level where it was obligatory to act according to them, deemed it necessary to abide by the addition, especially those who held that an addition does not imply abrogation. That's not the position of Abu Hanifa, he says. But in any event, uh, we see that the scholars, they look at the ahadith. He's going into some issues which, for our class, is not going to benefit of us to go into a lot of detail because everybody's level of knowledge is at different degrees. So we have to keep this as simple as possible so that you gain benefit from Bidayat al-Mujtahid in understanding how it is that Usul al-Fiqh applies and how it is that we have tools to deal with thinking through the deen. It's not just that we come up with our own conclusions. And you see here, the scholars are considering, is the hadith strong or not strong? Is it weak? Is it weak? Is it strong in its language? Is it strong in its transmission? That's all of that stuff they're including in their analysis. That's something that's very important to understand, because a lot of people will try to make you think that Islam, that the ulama, when it comes to Islam, they didn't study it, they didn't think through it. There's no system to it. It's just open to your understanding, your interpretation. It's not clear cut. How could this be? They're fabricated hadith. Oh my God, the deen is corrupt. Oh, this or that. We have to save the deen from this. These hadith contradict each other. How could you believe in the ahadith? You only have to believe in the Quran, right? All these Hanafis, they came up with this position as bid'ah. It's clear cut that the hadith, they say that it's 5 days, 5 times a day that we're obligated to pray. People come up with a lot of different ideas. They express a lot of different feelings about a situation which has been studied thoroughly. And so once you finish with this, you begin to have an appreciation for the fact that the scholars of Islam were meticulous, and it eases your heart. Not only were they meticulous, they were respectful of the differences that they had with each other. And so among the Sunnis, there's a certain space in which you can differ. If you can make a strong enough argument to support your practice, then it's allowable. But you have to make that argument with principles that are accepted. You can't just come up with your own principles. So Usul al-Fiqh gives us a system of principles by which we investigate the Quran and the Sunnah. But these are not individual opinions. You got to realize that. These are opinions that are held by bodies of scholars. So even among themselves, there's debates, right? Until we come to a point of clarity. And so that's how we get to systematize the knowledge here. Are there any questions in this? I don't know if we're being clear. That's the only difficulty with this format. That it's what are the clear rules that differentiate mustahab from farid? The language. The language of the Quran, for the most part, along with other evidences, but the language will determine. Usually something that's fard is tied into issue of punishment if it's left off. So the language of the Quran and the Sunnah, there's levels to it. And we do that in everyday life. There's certain things like we tell our children, and the way we talk to them in tone and emphasis. They know that this is a grave matter. It's not a matter which is just like a normal matter. Like, for instance, if you're driving with your child in the vehicle, may Allah protect all of us, and alhamdulillah, you put the child locks on, but the child is sitting in the back of the vehicle and starts to try to open the back, the back door, the door that is most closest to that child, and you scream at that child, right? Don't do that, right? And then versus your child is going into the refrigerator and trying to get something, and they may be hungry, but they climb on the refrigerator, the edge of the refrigerator, He say, don't do that. You know what I'm saying? And then you redirect the child. So clearly, in the first case, is a life or death situation in which there may be repercussions for that. You know what I'm saying? In that case, but in the Quran and Sunnah, there are repercussions, right? In the sense that you may the reason why I say like that because people have different disciplining techniques. But in the case of the Quran and Sunnah, the discipline technique will be, reward and punishment comes with that. Whereas if something is mustahab, if something is recommended, and by the way, in a general sense, this is for the sake of simplicity, mustahab, mandub, sunnah, all of those things pretty much mean the same thing as far as fiqh. Don't confuse the usage of the term sunnah in fiqh with the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad as a whole. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. That's a big mistake which people make. So when we say something is sunnah, uh, and we're talking about matters of halal and haram, we're talking about whether it's an obligation or not an obligation, right? And so the issue of how we determine what's fard and how we determine what's mustahab, it comes back to understanding the pattern of the language. That's something which is very, very key. Once you understand the pattern of the language, and that's why Usul al-Fiqh, this stuff is set out in Usul al-Fiqh, the principles for understanding the patterns of the language. Usul al-Fiqh revolves around the linguistic study in a general sense. It revolves around that point of determining if something is an obligation or not, and then determining the levels of clarity of the language. You can, in the simplest form possible, you can say that the study of language in Usul al-Fiqh is about clarity. What level of clarity are we dealing with in a text of the Quran and the Sunnah? And so when we approach a text of the Quran and the Sunnah, there's different categorizations, right? So a word, if it has one meaning, it goes into one category. If a word has two meanings, it goes into another category. If a word opens up to multiple meanings and it's not clear which one is the one we should use, it goes into another category. That type of categorization of the language is systematizes our approach to understanding Quran and Sunnah. So we know how to deal with it. If it has more than one meaning and is not clear, then we have to figure out how it is that we're going to determine the meaning. So that's going to either mean going to other ayat of the Quran, a hadith. There's a whole system, a whole process. And we do that. We work through the research. Not us per se, but the scholars have done this, right? But once you learn usul fiqh and you gain scholarly tools as a student of knowledge, as a young scholar or whatever, that stuff is open to you because you have the playground of knowledge with you. You have a whole bunch of scholars, hundreds and thousands of ulama that already have been down this route. So you test your skills, how you learn the principles. You try to determine for yourself what's going on, and then you test your conclusion with what has been said by scholars. And so here in Bidayat al-Mujtahid, this is kind of what he's doing for us. What he's doing for us is showing us the major points of conflict in Islamic scholarship. And then he's basically reconciling for us so that we understand why it is that they differ, and how did they reach their conclusions, right? And then, a lot of times you're not going to see that he's not going to say, this person is wrong, this person is right. What they call today, and it was called in the past, but today is popular, rajih. What is the most strongest position? Sometimes he'll just let it be. Sometimes he'll give a position and say, okay, here he's not saying, well, the majority of the scholars are more correct than the Hanafis on the issue of how many prayers are obligatory. He just shows you the concept and approximates for you the evidences, brings them close to you, shows you why it is that they differ, and kind of just leaves it there so that you respect the differences of the scholars. Are there any more questions? I need to know if this is clear for you guys. Was that clear for you, Arif? Okay. And so the lessons that we take from that first section is that always don't get caught up in the mindset that people have when they say, "Give me the delete," and they want to stunt you in saying, "Give me a hadith," or so on and so forth. Get into the frame of mind of learning the sources of knowledge. And we learned those by way of Usul al-Fiqh. We already took four sources of knowledge so far: the Quran, the Sunnah, consensus, Qiyas. And we said that under Qiyas, a whole lot of different types of reasoning are subsumed under it. So basically, you can say reason, Quran, Sunnah, and reasoning. And then even consensus can come under Quran, Sunnah. So those are the three sources of knowledge in Islam. And so in the case of the Salah, the first thing that you want to determine, right, is the sources of knowledge. And then from there, you get into the evidences. Why? Because if I say, give me the dalil, you see the issue. The issue here, we know that the Salah is obligatory. How? Because we determined that from the sources, and it's a matter that's clear cut. So we're beyond that. Now, if I were to say to you, give me the dalil, give me the evidence that the Salah is obligatory, and then I give them to you, and then I give you the hadith that says, well, we're supposed to pray 5 times a day. Oh, so now I'm giving you a hadith, we're supposed to pray 5 times a day. That hadith, right, when you put it in light of other hadith, it opens up a discussion, as we see. And so now the issue becomes, can you handle that discussion? If you can't handle that discussion, when the Hanafis come out and say, well, brother, make your witr, you're immediately going to get into a clash situation because you don't have the tools. You don't have the tools to understand how to deal with the ahadith. You don't have the experience of knowing that there's discussion out there regarding this issue among scholars in the past, and they have weight. There's a hadith that may seem to go against what your position is. And so that's why just asking for the evidence, it was without understanding the whole concept that there's a system to researching knowledge, it becomes somewhat problematic. I mean, we know the intent. The intent is good. The intent is to get people to become familiar with what they're practicing, what the basis is for what they practice. But where that has gone is that it has created also a lot of confusion in North America because a lot of people are not students. You know, even scholars are students. Don't think that scholars are not students. Everyone is at a different level. You know, like Imam Ahmed said, you know, that he's a talib ilm for life, that type of concept. So there's different degrees. So the issue is that here, there's no scholarly culture in North America. So people come up with their own conclusions on how they're going to approach Quran and Sunnah. So when we ask for evidence, remember that evidence is of two types: the source of knowledge and the detailed knowledge, right? The detailed knowledge is what we just covered. And so here now, we went from the Salah being an obligation to how many times is it obligatory on us during the day. And now we're going to the issue of who is obligated to pray. Who is obligated to pray? So the Sheikh, he says that this is the third issue that comes up in this section, right? So, or that was translated as such. And so now the issue becomes, who's the person that carries the responsibility of praying the Salah? So he says the person for whom the salah is obligatory, right? And this is something uh, that we have to study with a little more detail. The person for whom it is obligatory is every pubescent Muslim, and there's no dispute about this. Right? Not only every pubescent Muslim, but the one who's also sane, right? There has to be an issue of sanity there and conscious, because if a person is in a coma, the salah can be practiced, so there's not an obligation on that person, right? And so here there's a definition for who it is that is obligated to practice the deen. We're not going to go into that with a lot of detail now, but I just want you to know that there's some discussion on that, and in Usul al-Fiqh there's a whole section on that issue, on the issue of who is obligated to practice. So now parents have to be careful with this, because it's not just the issue of letting your children go crazy and do whatever they want. There's an issue of training involved. Why do I say that? Because sometimes when people say, well, the child is not pubescent, so they don't have to practice, there's the issue of training that comes along with that. And there's a hadith to indicate to that point, that we should be training our children, especially in the case of salah, even before puberty. But at the same time, there's also the other side of obligating our children to do certain things, and they're not even responsible to practice in the Sharia. We have to draw a fine line between education and training and obligating, right? Because the obligation, if we emphasize too much, and they're not really responsible, or if we emphasize in the wrong way, we can push them outside of the deen. It's not easy. This issue is not easy, because when you're in a Muslim society or a Muslim community, people usually go with what the community is doing. Even if they're faking, they kind of fall in line with the group, birds of a feather flock together type of concept. And so the issue here is that how do we emphasize obligations in an environment which at a certain point our children and our community members may reject, right? And so it's a fine line. In the Muslim community, outside of what we know, like for instance, in the Muslim society, there's a certain level of freedom and a certain level of coercion at the same time, especially when it comes to the issue of salah. There's, in that case, the political authorities have the right to intervene. They have the right to intervene Islamically. How they do it, that's discussed. How they do it is discussed. But they have the right to intervene if a person abandons the salah. The community has it, in other words, has the right to intervene. Because that's what we're talking about, community at a political level. So here in this type of society, which we live in a secular society, how we emphasize an obligation is something that needs to really be thought about, because we don't have that legal oomph. And also in the Muslim world, sometimes they have the legal oomph, like a place like Saudi Arabia, but they may not know how to use it properly, right? And so all those things come up for discussion. In any event, that's a side issue. So the issue comes up of abandoning the salah. That's the issue that comes up now. The obligation arising from intentional relinquishment. And the issue of, okay, so when he says issue 3, I forgot to mention this. When he says issue 3, Dr. Imran Niazi, that is from the book itself, but the 2.13 is not from the book. So here he says, أما ما الواجب على من ترك حمدا وأمر بها فأبى أن يسليها لا جهد لفرضها. So this is something that now is a big issue. What is the obligation with respect to the person who ceases to pray the salah intentionally, and then when he's ordered to pray, he refuses to do so. But that person is not denying that salah is obligatory. A group of scholars, or a group of here lawyers, we should say, in that time period, in which there was a political system, they had a different discussion on these issues. It wasn't a discussion the way that we have it, because we don't have a political system which is supporting Islam in the same way, right? So this became a legal issue in that time. So a group of jurors said that he should be executed, while another group said that he is to be punished and confined. Right? Among those who maintained that he is to be executed, some made his execution obligatory because they considered that to be an act of treason to the community. It's an act of disbelief, public disbelief, rejecting the well-being of the community, which is that Muslim community in that case is founded on the issue of salah. It's founded on the issue of worshiping Allah. So once that worship is undermined, then at that point that person is considered treasonous. That's part of how they were thinking about that. It's just like if a person was to do, that's the discussion now in this country with regard to the election fix and all that. Is that against the country? Something that is against the interest overall of the country or not? And that's how the Muslims thought about that. But they thought about it from the angle of religion, right? And so that's something which in the West is hard to understand, because for a long time, they feared the persecution of the church. So in Islam, Islam didn't go through the same thing that you see in the Middle Ages, or the Muslim community didn't go through the same historical processes or to the same extent when it comes to the state oppressing people because of their intellect. Actually, it was the opposite. Those who were hyper-rationalists, like the Mu'tazila, they had a tendency of oppressing those who didn't follow those approaches. So they were the rationalists in Islamic history. They tended to oppress people. Whereas in the West, it was the church that oppressed the rationalists. So we shouldn't confuse the two historical trajectories, right? So in any event here, to make sense of this, the issue is coming up with regard to how do we deal with a person like that. And we're just looking at the evidences of how the scholars construed their positions. Imam Ahmed actually had two opinions on the issue of Tarki Salah Kasalan. One opinion was this issue of he's considered to be a disbeliever, treasonous, and the other opinion kind of aligned itself with the majority, or that group that says that he's to be punished and confined. So Imam Ibn Rushd, and that's one of the benefits of this book, that you begin to see. And the Hanafi opinions, it doesn't always get the Hanafi opinions correct, because that's not the purpose of this book, to have specific, detailed accuracy with every opinion that's conveyed. That's not the purpose of this book. The purpose of this book is to convey ideas and see how to work through them, right? And the purpose of this book is not to take detailed knowledge of halal and haram from it, but you do get that. The purpose of this book, it will show you some evidences, how to understand those evidences, principles, how to understand these differences of opinion, to understand that fiqh is a wide discussion. And so here, he's conveying the position of Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal, Ishaq bin Rawih, and Ibn Mubarak, right? As well as the position of Imam Malik, Shafi'i, Abu Hanifa, and the Zahiri school. So with respect to the obligation of the salah, and a person who is not praying, and he's not doing so, or she's not doing so intentionally, and then they're commanded to pray, they refuse to. This is in the legal sense. But if you ask them, is salah is an obligation? They say, yeah, it's an obligation. What is the ruling of that person? A group of scholars. Why does this discussion come up? Because we just went through the discussion if salah is an obligation or not. So salah is an obligation by what sources? The Quran, the Sunnah, consensus. There's no debate about the issue. It's not even necessary to talk about it. Okay, so is salah obligatory once in a month, once in a lifetime? No, it's obligatory every day. We went through the discussion about whether it's obligatory 5 times a day only or more than 5. And so now we've come to the point. So, okay, what about if a person negates acting on the salah, but doesn't negate that the salah is an obligation, because we went through the evidences already that indicate that salah is an obligation. They're clear on that point. Okay, so now the discussion comes up. So some of the scholars said that that person should be executed, while another group said that he is to be punished and confined, but since we want to be up with the times, he or she. Among those who maintain that he is to be executed, some made his execution obligatory as a result of disbelief. So now, why is the person being executed? Because some classified that person as a disbeliever. This is the opinion of Imam Ahmed, Ishaq bin Awayh, and Ibn Mubarak. Others, they upheld his confinement and punishment till he resumed praying, determined it as a penalty, a had penalty, which is the opinion of Malik, Al-Shafi'i, Abu Hanifa, his disciples in the Zahiri school, meaning that he's not a kafir, but he violated one of the obligations of salah, and it just so happens that that obligation is enforced by the state in this case. So that person is not a kafir, but that person will be punished based on what? Based on his violation of the rules. The reason for their disagreement stems from the conflict of tradition. Again, why do they disagree? They disagree because the ahadith appear to contradict each other. Right? It is established from the Prophet ﷺ who said, shedding the blood of a Muslim does not become lawful except in 3 cases: disbelief after faith, fornication after marriage, and killing a human being when it is not in retaliation for another life. Right? And so now the issue comes up, when can you take the life of the person in that case? That's the discussion that they're having. And so this is the first issue that comes up. That this belief after faith. So then the one group that says that he's to be executed, they applied that hadith in that way. That's an act of disbelief, is a clear act of disbelief, and that's it. That's a process that they go through. They have to go through a legal, juridical process. It's not just an average person just coming up with his or her own conclusion. Remember that we're talking in the context of a political system. It is also related from the Prophet ﷺ in the tradition of Buraydah that he said the distinguishing factor between them and us is the salah. And so he who abandons it has committed disbelief. And so that's a narration which supports that first group, which says he's to be executed for disbelief. Or he said shirk is nothing but the abandonment of the salah. So all those narrations are supporting that position. So now here goes the other group, the narrations which support the other position. Those who understood from the term disbelief here to be actual rejection deemed this tradition to be a commentary on the words of the Prophet ﷺ. Disbelief after faith occurring in the tradition quoted above. Those who deemed it the use of the term disbelief here merely as a censure and a reproach. So the language of the hadith, then they see the language as being reprimanding language, not that it's actual disbelief, because the person still believes in the obligation of the salah. So because the person still believes in the obligation of the salah, that keeps them in the fold of belief. So if they're executed, it's because of the punishment that comes along with abandoning the salah, and that would be part of the legal system in a Muslim society, right? In a Muslim society, that would be part of the legal system. But that's how it was in the past. So here, the language, they read it in another way, not in a way which determines that he's a kafir or she's a kafir for abandoning the salah, but still believing in the obligation, right? Here, uh, they took it the other way, that the language is just reprimanding. And it says, it means that his acts are like those of the disbelievers, and that he resembles the disbelievers. It is just like saying a fornicator does not commit fornication and remain a believer, or a thief does not commit, is kufr bidun kufr, as some of them say. Is unbelief without the act of unbelief, right? In other words, you're acting like a disbeliever, but you're not a disbeliever. That concept. So this ties into issues of aqidah. So for that reason, they held that the had penalty is not to be imposed in this case, right? And so what they did was that they preferred that the person should be confined, and punished. But at a certain point, the issue of execution comes up as well, still. But there's a process in that. There's a process in that the person is confined and punished, until they change their ways. So they took a more cautious approach. If we were to do that nowadays, so many people would, have issues in that regard. And that's not for me to discuss whether it's applicable nowadays or not. The issue for me to discuss is, that we have to have a dawah strategy for how we're dealing with ourselves and people, because people are struggling in their deen. And so it's not just the issue of reading what's in the fiqh books and saying, well, this is the case, this has to be applied now like this. No, there's a process to that. And like I said, a lot of this discussion is in the context of a legal system where you have authority, checks and balances. If you don't have that, it's a mess, right? It's a mess, and it becomes a situation which is chaotic. It becomes a situation which life is not valued. But the point here is just to see how the scholars went through these processes of looking at these evidences and coming to conclusions. Let's take a break right now, and then come back. If there's any questions, any points of any issues where there's lack of clarity. This is the way that we're doing this is a very traditional way of studying, in the sense that we're reading directly from the book, we're stopping, thinking with it. Yeah, really, this is the traditional approach versus the university approach of putting everything out there, clear cut in a systematic way. In the traditional approach, you're forced to kind of think through the text and make sense of it. And so you learn how to read that way. It's boring. It's a boring approach, but at the same time, it gives you rigor with time. It gives you rigor with time because you develop the ability to extract from the book. Whereas, and it's not to say that the university system is all bad. It's not. That has its benefit. But it doesn't teach you how to read. It just teaches you how to collect information. So, and it teaches you how to systematize to a certain extent, because knowledge is just simplified for you. And as Muslims, we have to break from that, because that's not that's good for a cultural understanding of a matter, but it's not good for a scholarly understanding. You have to get dirty in scholarly work. You have to put in the time. And so here, there's a number of different narrations that need to be looked at. And from there, you learn the fiqh of hadith, how it is that the scholars are understanding these narrations. So let's take a break, because now what's coming next is how it is that they constructed these positions, right? And so that's going to take, it's a little more dense. So if there's any questions, just let me know, and we'll stop the video here. That way, it's easier to upload. Okay, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes. Assalamu alaikum.